Institute. I'm also author of a book that came out 10 years ago called Game On, the All-American Race to Make Champions of Our Children. So this topic has particular interest in me because this is actually my son on the cover here. And I was such a crazy man back in the day. I was working for ESPN at the time. And it was the early days of genetic knowledge in sports. And I actually got this little guy when he was in diapers tested for a couple of different athletic traits. When I actually took a cheek swab all the way to Australia to understand one particular dimension of his possible athleticism. So this is really just an extraordinary topic, and we have two incredible people here to explore it with us, folks who are right on the cutting edge of genetic science and sports. And they are Dr. Stuart Kim, who is Professor Emeritus of Developmental Biology at Stanford. He retired from Stanford in 2016 to work full-time on genetics of sports injuries to benefit athletes. Not an easy thing giving up a tenured position at Stanford, but he did it because he was so excited about this particular opportunity. He is founder of the company we'll be talking about today, AxGen. And Megan Roche, who is next to him, is a professional trail and ultra runner for Hoka 11. She is co-founder of Some Work, All Play running group. Can I join that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Even if I can only run 2 miles at a time?
You're a perfect candidate.
You guys can go on. And she's also a clinical researcher at Stanford University working with Dr. Kim. She's a 5-time national trail running champion, the North American mountain running champion, and a 6-time member of the USA track and field team. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get going here. A reminder to silence your cell phones. We invite you to share your ideas on this fascinating topic with the hashtag AspenIdeas. And also, please rate the session on the Aspen Ideas Fest app. That'll help us improve our programming moving forward. So, Dr. Kim, take us, we all took biology back in high school, and genetics wasn't even a big part of it back when we were doing it. A lot has happened in recent years. Give us a very quick primer on A, what is the genome? B, what is genomics? And 3, what is genetic sequencing? That'll set the table for what we're going to talk about today.
Well, your genome is all of the DNA inside you, so it's this big, 3 billion nucleotides long. That's a lot. And you get one copy of the genome from your dad, and you get another copy of a genome from your mom. So there's every time you have 2 nucleotides, one from your dad, one from your mom. Most of the time, your mom and dad give you the same nucleotide. But sometimes they give you a different nucleotide. One might be a G, the other one might be a C. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it makes a difference if it's a G or a C. So that's the genome. And genomics is if you have enough people, you can know that the C might put you at higher risk for a sports injury. So if you have enough people, you can look at all the people that had a knee injury. And then you find out that people with a C tended to have a knee injury more often. So 2 years ago, I got access to large public data sets of about 100,000 people from San Francisco and 500,000 people from UK, bless the hearts of the Brits.
And these data sets did not exist previously. The ability to query
No,
that
just appeared around 2016. And that let me do some research at Stanford to identify these genetic markers we'll talk about today that start to really inform about what types of injuries, musculoskeletal injuries you could have. So you could be at a higher risk for knee injury, and you could be at higher risk for shoulder injury. And now if you're all on my team, I could know that, and I could, instead of treating you all the same, I could train you for your knee injury and you for your shoulder injury, maybe Tom, you for plantar fasciitis, and all you would see is a little bit different in your training regimen, but like if Megan was the coach, she could implement this informed training to you so that you'll come into the season a little bit protected. That's the whole idea. The thing I like about this is that, like, we're at the beginning age of human genetics. It's growing rapidly. I know over the next 5 years we're going to see all sorts of new discoveries. But already the edges that we have that are really pretty legitimate and pretty valid. I mean, a card-carrying geneticist doesn't mind using that. So I think it's pretty legitimate. But it's going to help you now. And so the idea is for you to, we could implement all of these discoveries that are just 2 years old. We could implement this for the first time to try to prevent injuries before they occur. Now, I come from the Bay Area, so you know what I'm going to talk about. We just lost the finals because our 2 guys got hurt. And so injuries...
Wait, you're on the roster?
No, it's a collective us, because that's all we talk about. But, they got hurt during the finals on their free agent year. So this is the perfect worst storm for Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson of the Golden State Warriors. This new information could really protect, for these elite athletes, they have events coming up in their lives that it's almost more than health. I mean, it's not just like he got a sprain. If you have an ankle sprain, for me, that's not much. But an ankle sprain in the playoffs is the playoffs, and then the whole team loses. So the magnitude of the information, the catastrophe is great. The test is easy, and I see a way forward to implementing this.
Yeah, so we'll loop back to the implications, but just to set the table off the top here, as we look down the road, this knowledge that you are developing could be knowledge that pretty much every athlete would want to have to determine their risk profile for certain injuries, which could then change the decisions made by them and the teams that they're working with about whether to play in a game or not, right?
It's not, look, I'm a scientist, but I can see what we're going to know in 3 years. And it's going to be, you're going to need to know. We know this much more now. We're going to know this much 3 years from now and more. So eventually you're going to use this. And the issue is who wants to be an early adopter to try to get the early protection, and who wants to wait until there's varying levels of certainty about the whole program. But it's been validated on 50,000 people. I'm not that worried that it's not true. The issue is how do you implement it on your elite athletes? And we can implement that now. We just have to, there'll be some more validation coming around in the next 2 years, but it's going to work.
All right, so Dr. Kim, give me your backstory a little bit. I mean, how did you come to this, sports injuries and genetics?
So for most of my career at Stanford, I'm not a young chicken. Most of my career at Stanford, I'm researching other stuff and with other organisms. So I was doing basic genetics on aging. And I was on the advisory board at a research institute. And the president of that was Jim, who was the next football player. And all that happened was Jim and I had lunch. And at the end of lunch, we decided to do a fun side project called What Makes a Football Player So Big and Strong? And so we tried to do big and strong genetics on the football players. That was a disaster. But it was a disaster because they are all big and strong. So there was no reason for me to tell them that they had this actinin-3 endurance allele. This was kind of stupid.
That's the one I got my son tested for.
That one.
They said he shouldn't go into football.
There are plenty of starting offensive linemen that have any genotype of that. So your son is still on track to being the biggest, strongest athlete there is. They didn't know about injury. That completely scared them, and that was really useful. So since then, I've been doing science research on the genetics of injuries. And it's a good deal when you tell students at Stanford and they switch their lives. So in 2012, I just said, I'm doing a side project on the genetics of sports injuries, and 4 switched their majors and 2 switched their PhD programs to start doing this. And so we've all thought that this is a great idea. And then it was, not many people quit when you're full professor with tenure at Stanford. So, but I thought this idea was so good, I just decided you got to do it. I got to do it. So I did that.
That's good. Now, Megan, how did you come to this?
So this is interesting. So I was a med student when I met Stuart, and Stuart is a very big deal at Stanford. He's not going to tell you that, but he is kind of really well known in the world of genetics as well as developmental biology. So as a medical student, I was a little nervous to go up and knock on his door. And as I turned the corner and saw his door, there was a Vin Diesel poster on the door, and this was from one of his former students who hung it up. And that was the moment I knew. I was like, okay, I would love to work with Stuart Kim. And so we started talking. We started a research project in Stanford's varsity cross-country and track team. And then from there, we talked about working together in ActGen and taking this research project and allowing elite athletes and recreational athletes to access it as well.
Oh, very good. So what? So why? How do you go about your work here? I mean, tell me. You're testing for injury-related traits. What is the process? It starts with a cheek swab or something, right?
That has all been done by these public research databases. So, so my colleagues at San Francisco and at the UK, who I've never met, but they've generated this data where they have the DNA from hundreds of thousands of people and all their medical records. So then I can go and we can ask, tell me everybody who had a knee injury, and then we'll see, and tell me their DNA, and then we can crank and figure out what part of our genomes are associated with knee injuries. Mm-hmm. And then after that, we do ankle injuries. Mm-hmm. And soon as we get the next batch of data, we're going to do hamstring injuries. So, so the key is we have the medical record. If it's an injury that gets you to the hospital, we could look and research it. Mm-hmm. And it's now 600,000 people we have access to. Mm-hmm. In 2015, people were studying 200 people. And now in 2019, we're studying 600,000 people. So that tells you that there's like a treasure trove open, in the last couple of years. And now we can just crank on that. Faster we crank on that, the faster we'll have markers for the 7 injuries we can talk about today. But that list is going to grow in the next year or two.
Gotcha. And ActGen started, when did the company open its doors?
It opened in January. We started 3 weeks ago in June because of the Aspen Ideas Festival. So Aspen called us up and said they had heard about us, could we do a demo? And then, so we built this web platform, not for Aspen, but knowing that Aspen, this will be our first rollout. You are seeing kind of like the first time this has been tested on elite athletes. So we've gotten 100 professional athletes, former football players, mm-hmm. professional track runners, professional mm-hmm. endurance runners, mm-hmm. professional triathletes. They're in this batch. Mm-hmm. We ran through them. You were just last Thursday.
Am I one of those elite athletes?
Of course.
Yeah. And so you're going to see how it all worked. We knew Tom was going to present up here before we knew what the results were going to be. So you'll see for the first time what happens, and you can give us feedback and let us know if you think it was useful or not.
So the way it practically comes together is a cheek swab, and the test costs, what, $100, $150 or something, or $500?
We're making up the price now, but we have a promo code. It's $200.
$200, okay. So someone pays it, they do the cheek swab, they send it to you, and then how long does it take to get the results?
You get, when you have the cheek swab, you mail it back in like 2 weeks.
Like 2 weeks.
Something like that.
Okay, good. All right, so let's kind of show people what happens when you get tested for these traits. This is on your website. It's an image. Well, why don't, Dr. Kim, why don't you kind of walk it through? These are Megan's results, right?
Right.
Yep.
Well, Megan has the MD, so I think I'm going to defer to her. But this is we call it the summary page. There are 8 tests here. So this is the best result you can have. 2 green markers, that means you're doing better than normal. So she's at decreased risk for the 2 injuries, stress fracture and plantar fasciitis. She's normal for every other result. And there's one that's not an injury. It's called caffeine sensitivity. So when Megan tunes how she uses caffeine for performance, this will be some information for whether she's a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. She can opt in that way. But Megan, you can explain the different injuries and how, as a coach and as an elite endurance runner, what they mean to you.
And also, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of injuries.
Right.
There are many more that, parts of your body that could be injured or otherwise that are not in there. So maybe you can explain why those and what they mean.
Well, it's a little bit ironic because this result looks so beautiful, yet I'm standing up here on one leg with a hamstring rupture. But we're hoping to include hamstring markers in our coming data set, which I'll be fascinated to look at. But I was pleased to see this result. As a runner, for me, stress fractures and plantar fasciitis are actually 2 big concerns. Those are very common injuries that are seen in the running population. And so for me, I was excited to see the decreased risk. I actually happen to know my bone mineral density, which is a little bit on the lower side. It's not too bad. And so by seeing this result and seeing that my bone density is actually predicted to be strong, it makes me excited that once my hamstring heals up, that I can get back in the gym and do some strength training and really start to work on that. And then I'll just give a little bit of a primer maybe on the injuries just so that we can all understand what they are. So bone mineral density is relevant for stress fractures as well as fractures in the older population. It's one of those things that is actually a very strong genetic marker, and so we're proud to present these results to athletes when we get them. With plantar fasciitis is essentially the part on the foot that extends from the heel up towards the toe. It receives a lot of stress during running and walking, and so endurance athletes commonly have plantar fasciitis. It's actually 20% in the regular population and then higher in the endurance running populations. Ankle injury includes things like ankle sprains, which are common in athletes who are cutting or jumping. That can involve either a torn ligament or a sprained ankle ligament. Stuart talked about the caffeine sensitivity, and we can dive into that a little bit more with Tom's results.
Right.
De Quervain's tendinosynovitis is a very long and confusing word. We have a lot of athletes who test with us and they're like, what is this DQT thing? So De Quervain's tendinosynovitis is essentially inflammation in the tendons of the thumb. It's common in athletes who are grasping or gripping or throwing. MCL injury is a knee injury. It's one of the ligaments of the knee. It's commonly injured in basketball players or football players. And then
we don't have ACLs.
We don't have ACLs, which would have been relevant for Klay Thompson, who just sustained an ACL injury for the Warriors.
Could we have ACL injuries as part of this?
We hope to.
It's on the next batch of data, due to arrive any day now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll actually be starting my PhD in the fall, and the first thing I'm going to look at is hamstring rupture, and the second thing I'm going to look at is ACL rupture. So I'm pretty excited for that. And then the last 2 are rotator cuff tears. The rotator cuff is a muscle that's involved in shoulder stability. It pretty much prevents your shoulder from popping out or dislocating. Rotator cuff tears are common in snowboarders and skiers, as well as anyone else who might be falling on an outstretched arm, as well as overhead athletes. And then the last one is shoulder instability, which also kind of relates a little bit to rotator cuff tears. So shoulder instability involves any event where your shoulder pops out or dislocates, or even just where your shoulder feels apprehension, which is where it feels like it might pop out. So those are the injuries that we test for, and we're excited to start including some more markers.
So, let's talk about an ACL injury once you're able to add that. If, say, Klay Thompson was tested and had some understanding about whether he was at increased risk or decreased risk, how might that, or what about Achilles? Kevin Durant, do I go back into the game or not? If he had that type of information, how do you think that might shape, outcomes?
I think Kevin Durant is actually a great example because he was listed as having a calf strain as the reason that he was out for the several months prior to his Achilles rupture. I think if he had had this genetic testing and had an elevated marker for Achilles rupture, I think we all would have been really careful about putting him in because when you take the risk of calf strain as well as the genetic risk of Achilles rupture and put those two together, you realize that he's at increased risk. And for him, that has massive financial implications. And I think that really would have changed the decision making. It also might have changed the rehab process too, where it becomes a little bit more focused on making sure that his Achilles is stable and as strong as it can be.
And the idea with Kevin would be to have tested him last year, and in the off season, his personal trainer could be working with him and then do rehabilitation exercises for Achilles injury. So hopefully he always has the genetic risk, let's say. I don't know if he does, but if he would always have that, but it could have been counteracted by his trainer working on whatever exercises are most appropriate for that. Or it could be movement, just to dial in his movement and not put strains on his Achilles tendons. So there's all sorts of ways that once an elite trainer knows Achilles tendon, they can do the prevention. They just have to know where the injury is most likely to occur.
I can imagine it also has implications on return to play, right? So we're all thinking he's going to be back in the later part of next year.
Yeah.
If we know he has, say, an increased risk
Right.
of, Achilles injury, maybe you hold off an extra month or so. Is that how the information could be used?
Could be. That part Megan's the MD, I'm the scientist. So we'll see.
Yeah, I would say with some of these genetic markers, we have a very clear reason as to why they're causing the increased risk for injury. And for some of them, we're still learning. We have so much to learn about the human genome. And so if we had a marker that we weren't quite sure why exactly it was causing this increased risk of injury, you could say, well, maybe this impacts surgery recovery, or maybe this impacts the integrity of the Achilles. And that would be really relevant in someone who's coming back from surgery.
Good. So let's take a look at the next slide here. These are the results of April Nelson. So Megan, you're familiar with April, I am not. Why don't you give a little bit of background on her and what her results suggest?
So my husband and I coach a number of elite endurance athletes, and we actually did our first alpha testing rollout in these athletes. And it was really meaningful as a coach to get 50 of our athletes' results come back in and to be able to sort by high risk and low risk and kind of use that approach to tailor training. So April is one of the athletes that we coach. She's in her late 40s. This is really exciting, but she ran a sub 3-hour marathon at 47, which is a pretty big deal. And that was a fast time for her. She actually has had a long career of struggling with stress fractures, including one in the femoral neck, which is a pretty high-risk location for stress fractures. She's also adopted as well, and so she wasn't totally sure about her genetic history or kind of her parents' predisposition to injury. So we did the genetic test on her, and she actually came back with some interesting results. So for her bone mineral density, she was in the 8th percentile for bone mineral density, which makes sense because she's had so many stress fractures. And for her, it was actually informative for her to see that. I think sometimes when athletes get stress fractures, they wonder, what am I doing wrong? Is this something that I'm doing to my body? And I think for her, it was almost reassuring to see that there's some element of genetics playing into this. We estimate that genetics range anywhere from 30 to 80% of your bone mineral density, so that's pretty significant. And so for her, we're going to take this information and really make sure that we add in that resistance training that can help load her bones. The other thing was that she had a high risk of shoulder instability, so 186%, which is that's massively elevated. And so she actually has had dislocations in one of her shoulder, and then she feels instability in her other. And so as we were presenting this information to us, she just was like, I feel like this is so relevant to me. I really feel like these genetics are speaking to the injuries I've had. And for Stuart and I think that was a pivotal moment where we realized just how powerful these tests could be.
And the key is they're reliable now because we have these large databases to compare them against, right? Because, for instance, when I got my son tested for ACTN3, it was before any of that existed. There were small studies of elite athletes, a limited number of people, and conclusions were drawn. And then as the science evolved, we found out that, yeah, maybe it's not that predictive really, right? So A, did I get all that correct? And B, now that you have these large databases, how much can we actually say, yep, that actually is about 180% increased risk? Or will these results change over time as we learn more?
Okay. These results that we're talking about now and are 2 years or so old are about 100,000 times stronger than the results that were available in 2015, including what you had available for your son. And so in 2016, that 100,000-fold, convinced me. Now we're starting to talk about something that's a little bit more rigorous. The stress fracture test is much stronger than that still. The effect sizes, that's whether it makes a difference. So what's interesting is when I talk to my health colleagues, I've published papers on kidney disease. And there's no talk about using genetic testing for kidney disease because it's hard to convince a normal patient like me to do anything about kidney disease. So, don't eat salt. I mean, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to have kidney disease, right? But with the athletes, they'll all comply. I mean, they really understand this 1% difference in the meaning of an injury. The stress injury effect size is pretty big. It's about as strong, it's about as informative as smoking is for getting lung cancer. So if you think whether or not smoking is worth doing to avoid, not smoking is worth doing to avoid lung cancer, then this test is about as informative as that.
What I really appreciate about working with Stuart is that Stuart is such a dedicated scientist that when we present all of these results to our athletes, we're very clear about the effect size and the p-values, and Stuart's able to break it down in a way that athletes are able to understand the science. And I think it's a really fun dialogue with athletes to be able to translate that for them.
Now, are there any limitations to these results? I mean, so for instance, your two databases, the Bay Area, the UK, largely white folks, right, that we're pulling from. April, I don't know what her ethnicity is. Maybe she's, I don't know.
She's Asian.
She's Asian, okay. I didn't want to assume there. So, how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, it's civilians. So, some of these people aren't going to get injured because they sit on the couch. Not athletes. And one of the things we're doing is we're doing research with every group of athletes. We have, this weekend we're doing research on ultramarathon runners at Lake Tahoe, and I'm doing research on we're doing research on the Stanford cross country runners. So, Stanford cross country is a thing where 50% of them are going to get stress fractures. So they're really run until it hurts, and it's mostly white guys. That's just how it's going to be because it's mostly white guys that are funding the research. There's a little bit of Asians in the San Francisco database, and there's Africans and Indians in the UK database. So in a lot of cases, I can tell you it's about the same for Asians. But sometimes to get the exact data for Asians, I'm going to need 100,000 Asians, which will happen in 2 years, but it's just not today.
So are these results still applicable to someone who is African American or
It goes on a case-by-case basis, and in the website it's written. So for a stress fracture, it works for an Asian, just not as well. And I know exactly how much not as well works. So it's still useful information. It's just not dialed in for the European genome.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk about the non-elite athlete in the bunch here. That would be me. So when I heard about this, I said, Stuart, please, I would love to know what my results are. I like information. I don't always treat it like it's the Bible and I have to, but it's a piece of knowledge that I want to have as I chart my course. And these are the results that came back. So tell me what I'm looking at here.
Well, to start, you're an elite interviewer, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Also, I really appreciate, so we had this conversation before his results were ready, and you're like, I will share my results however they come back. And so I really appreciate that you're willing to be so open. So you do have an elevated risk for stress fracture, and that's a result of having potentially lower bone mineral density based on your genetics. And so you were in, I believe it was the 12th percentile for bone mineral density.
Really?
Yes.
I'm that low?
It was a little bit low, but I would say that given what I know about you as an athlete and the background that you've had with the sports that you've done, my bet is that you've modified that over time because you're doing weight-bearing exercise. And so if I were counseling you formally, I would say, we should look at these genetic results, but also understand the history that you've had as an athlete.
And so should I take calcium pills or things that are going to, I don't know.
If you
Mitigate?
were one of my runners, I would probably encourage you to take vitamin D. It's a very controversial thing, and I usually defer that to the physician. At Action, we always say, this is a discussion for your primary care doctor. But I think it's informative for you to take these values and then go to your primary care doctor and say, hey, I'm at potentially increased risk for stress fracture. Is there something I should do about that? And that's when you can talk about measuring your vitamin D levels or your calcium levels and kind of going from there.
The next one is plantar fasciitis, right?
Plantar fasciitis, yes.
Yep.
So plantar fasciitis is common. You actually don't have a significantly elevated risk compared to the regular population, but because plantar fasciitis is so common, I would say that's something that you should modify and be careful about. So doing things like working the intrinsic and extrinsic foot muscles can help prevent plantar fasciitis. The other thing is that plantar fasciitis is a pretty chronic injury. So athletes will often have heel pain for a long time before they even realize they have plantar fasciitis. So this is one of those results where you could say, hey, I'm waking up in the morning with heel pain. Maybe I'm at increased risk for plantar fasciitis. I should probably back off my training. And that's where I can see the result as being really valuable.
The great irony here is what I do physically is I live in San Clemente, California. I surf once or twice a week. I play a little bit of soccer, and I also play beach volleyball. And I actually had a plantar fasciitis injury about 3 months ago. So now I know why. Right?
I imagine it's still lingering. Plantar fasciitis can take a long time.
It did. It took a while to work its way through. That's great. All right, so the caffeine sensitivity, let's talk about that there. What is this chart in layman's language, and how do we interpret it?
This blue chart tells you the x-axis shows your genetic result, and it's the prediction of how much coffee you drink compared to average. And so it's a histogram of something like 100,000 people that replied how much coffee they drank. And then there was 8 spots in your genome that had a fairly big effect on how much coffee you drink in a day. A little bit more, a little bit less. And then each one tells you a little bit about your coffee drink, but when you add them all together, it's a stronger guess about your coffee usage. So here, the genetic guess, based only on your genetics, from these 8 markers, says you were pushed off to the left. So you're the red line going up and down, and the blue is the histogram of everybody, 100,000 people. And you're, compared to the 100,000 people, you're kind of off on the left, which would be slow metabolizer. So this genetics would say you probably, the coffee lasts in you. Slow metabolizer, it means that, metabolize means that you get rid of the caffeine after you drink the coffee. So whether you clear the caffeine in 2 hours or 3 hours is the difference between fast and slow. And this would sort of predict that you're kind of a slow metabolizer. Coffee will last longer in you. And so that's fine for your day job, but when you go out and you drink caffeine to enhance your performance, that's an ergogenic effect of caffeine. You could know that probably less will affect you and affect you longer as you're trying to dial in the sweet spot about when to take it and how much to take it.
So I have a cup of coffee every morning,
Okay.
7 a.m. or so. If I have a soccer game at 10 a.m. or so, what you're telling me is I'm still going to feel the ergogenic effects of caffeine if it's a 10 o'clock game, or maybe it's a 9 o'clock game or 11.
Right.
How do I practically interpret that?
the actual rules. There are no, so that's the part of the research that's still going on. So what would be great would be to find a team where we could put them onto the time trial and measure scientifically, like, okay, you took 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams of caffeine before the time trial, and how fast can you grow? So some guys in Toronto did that, and it was a great result. So they found that caffeine makes athletes go faster on a time trial, 6%, but only if they're only if they're fast metabolizers. The slow metabolizers went 13% slower. So there's a clear case to me where you should know if you're going to be a time trial on the, and 6% versus minus 13%, that's huge. So you got to know which type of caffeine to take, lot or less, for dialing in, optimizing your ergogenics based on your genetics.
Right, gotcha. And we are going to go to questions. We're going to leave a good 10, 15 minutes at the end of this session, because I know this is fascinating. Some of you have better questions than I'm asking right now. But I do want to kind of work through a couple other implications here, because I think this is fascinating, not just in terms of individual performance of elite athletes or even weekend warriors, but the implications on public health potentially down the road. You know, we in our program do a lot of work with, it's called Project Klay, how to build healthier communities through sports, starting with kids. How do we get every child a sport opportunity that is healthy and sustained and will set them up for a life of physical activity? So immediately my mind went to, when I saw this type of slide, was, wow, what if we got every kid going into high school tested so they have knowledge about their body and how much they can, how they can handle it, maybe even the best sports or positions that they should play with that knowledge. So talk to me about how you see this knowledge you're developing potentially impacting public health on a large scale, starting with a young population.
I love that idea, because high school athletes, their bones are developing, their tendons are developing, their muscles are developing. They're kind of setting themselves up for the stages of life where they get to compete as a lifelong athlete, or just get out to be recreational or to jog or to stay fit. I think a great example of that is in the bone mineral density. So we actually accrue the large majority of our bone mineral density in the adolescent years. And so if we can give these results to athletes in their adolescent years, we can hit athletes who are at higher genetic risk and enable them to take the precautions to build up their bone density. This is really relevant in something like track and field, where there's a high number of high school athletes who are sustaining stress fractures. And I think it just raises awareness and kind of helps them understand how to guide their training and their recovery process.
Tom, we also think a lot at AxGen about genetic discrimination of athletes. And so a situation where a pro athlete where the owner knows the pro athlete's risks and uses that at contract time, or even parents try to direct their kids into one sport versus another sport, we need to get out front and make sure that we're offering the most positive aspects of genetic testing and keeping away from any of these negative aspects. So for your kid, the way I would think about it is, imagine all the potential athletes that never were because they got an accident, a knee accident, and all of a sudden you're not, you don't ski as much. So avoiding that injury, especially when you're young, you could enjoy a lot more of your athletic years by avoiding injuries. So I see that as being a benefit. Then, I would just work hard and try to not let this get blown out of. What sport your son plays, I think, is going to be mostly on his talent. And if he's good at soccer, he should play soccer, even if
And what he wants to play, where their love of the sport is, right?
So I like that. And then trying to convince him he should be a swimmer versus a soccer player based on these genetics, that seems a little premature to me.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have a soccer player that isn't injured versus converting to the swimmer.
What about genes like APOE4, APOE, which is tied to, well, you tell me, it's related to concussions and the ability to recover from brain injuries, yes?
it has been published as related to concussions. I don't think the data are really that strong. But it is tied to Alzheimer's risk, so that's for sure. But let's imagine it is for concussion. Yeah, so concussion is a hard one. And we are going to find genetic markers for concussion. That's on the list of stuff that we're going to do later this summer. What if we find concussion markers? Because there's not much you can do to train it. I mean, it's not an exercise for your head. So now that's going to be, and I can tell you the NFL and the military want to use that to try to stop the concussions before that happens. So for the military, we have talked to the special ops, and they would just say, okay, so you don't fire a bazooka as part of your training. So they have bazookas that are so big that the explosion gives them the concussion. And so maybe just don't have them, fire the tank and fire the bazooka, and now you have a soldier that doesn't get hurt. I don't know what the NFL is going to do.
Well, this is a real conundrum in sports and in football, head contact sports, because some people will play that game, play football, for
No matter what.
20 years, and they're fine. They
Yeah.
don't have any no cognitive or emotional issues, no apparent brain damage.
Yeah.
Others will play for a very limited period of time, maybe through high school or even early college, and they have many more problems. They seem to be more susceptible to concussions, and then they don't recover as well.
Yeah.
So it does beg this question about how much of that is genetic predisposition.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't think we know yet, and I think I think the work in CTE in that area is really developing, which is a hot topic in football right now. And I think it's in the next couple of years we're going to learn more and more. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to impact return to play decisions primarily, I can see.
yep. What about obesity risk? I mean, is that something that could be plugged into this? And if you have an adolescent or even a young adult, in terms of helping guide them into activity that's going to reduce their, potential to develop obesity?
Tom, you're asking all the great questions. You guys, he's asking us the questions about what we're debating about in the company about obesity risk. Yeah. So 2 weeks ago, major paper got published called "We Can Predict Your Genetic Weight." And basically, they have a very, very strong predictor of genetic weight. So when you're a baby, you could know if you're likely to be heavyweight or thin. So that's possible scientifically. Mm-hmm. And so what Megan and I are discussing is it worth telling our players? It's trivial for us to do it. And so I'll let Megan say, but she has good ideas of how your genetic weight could inform you as an athlete.
Well, this is topical. I appreciate you bringing this up because it's been a company-wide discussion, so it's helpful to have it up here on stage. But I'm a fan of actually just presenting the genetic markers as we know them, because I think each genetic marker informs athletes differently based on their individual characteristics. So for me, if I had an athlete who had a risk for elevated BMI, and weight is it's something that should be discussed very gently in athletics, just because of the kind of like the replications that can happen with these discussions. But I think it informs how you recover from injury, how you cross-train in the off-season. I think a lot of athletes, when they transition from being a high-level athlete to being a recreational athlete, they can put on weight. And I think if you have an elevated risk factor for higher BMI, you'd be more aware of that up front.
Interesting. Questions? Yeah, you wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Have alleles been identified that are predictive of VO2 max? And if they have been identified, what is the percentage of VO2 max attributed to genetics versus training?
VO2 max is right on the border of scientific rigor. So I don't think there are a number of papers. Do you know the literature? I mean, do you know which ones I'm talking about? But there are a bunch of papers. It's the level of reproducibility of that stuff. I think I'd like to get that a little bit higher before ActGen reports on it. But there are they're published VO2 genetic markers. So your question is, would that be useful to know about?
I think as a coach, it would be useful. I actually encourage my athletes not to get VO2 max testing because I don't want them to know where they are. I think it's better to just think you have a high VO2 max and go with that. I think if you get genetically tested, you can kind of have an idea of where you are, but it leaves room for imagination. And so I think it could be valuable, but we're waiting for more scientific rigor.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, hi. This is really exciting research, and I think it's super fascinating. But Megan probably knows I'm sort of a skeptic here. I'm just curious about what this actually adds, or what it, for a test to really be useful, it has to change the outcome and has to change what you'll be doing. And there's sort of a standard protocol for deciding whether to use a screening test. And there was a really interesting paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine a few years ago by Ronald Behar. You guys have probably seen it, but it's about the title, I just looked it up, Why Screening Tests to Predict Injury Do Not Work and Probably Never Will. And it's sort of a review of these concepts. And I just wonder, some of the things that you've been talking about, plantar fasciitis, bone density, things like this, are there things that are really different? Like, so with bone density, you want all of your athletes probably to do these things. And with plantar fasciitis, any athlete who has heel pain, you want them to be addressing it and things like this. So I'm just wondering what it's really changing or what it's really adding at this point that's sort of a value added or that's different. And then I guess the other component of that is that all of these injuries can have multiple causes, and so the genetics are just one little sliver, and so then you also have the danger that someone says, oh, I tested low for that, so I don't need to worry about it, when yet, particularly with like an injury that could be a traumatic sort of injury, that you can't just assume that it won't happen, right?
Those are two great questions. I would say actually that we saw really the value of this genetic testing last week when we tested an athlete that I coach. She is a competitive runner. She's actually never had a stress fracture, but she was genetically listed in the 2nd percentile for bone mineral density. And for her, she really hadn't been supplementing with vitamin D, hadn't been taking calcium, and as an action genetic counselor, I'm not going to tell her to do that because that's not within my place. But we certainly referred her to a primary care doctor to start the process of getting a bone mineral density test, to start the process of talking about vitamin D supplementation, just because the genetic algorithm is so strong that in that 2nd percentile, you're at a much, much higher risk. And so that was, I think genetic testing is really valuable at the extremes. And for me as I coach, when I go through 100 athletes, I'm going to statistically have people in that extreme. And so for me, that was a case that was really fascinating.
Also, the science is changing rapidly. So when that article was written, they were writing about the 2015 technology, and this stuff is 100,000 times stronger than then, and next year it'll be stronger still. So I think they're going to write, the next article they write is, it's starting to work, and the next year they'll write, it's working, you gotta try it. So I just don't feel like they were writing the opinion piece based on ancient technology. So I agree with them at the time that they wrote it, but I don't think it's true anymore.
But she does raise a good point, though. I mean, the importance of genetic counseling, when these results are delivered, how to help the person who is receiving them process that information in the appropriate way. Saying, okay, there are other factors. Where are we on responsibly conveying the information related to these findings?
That's another great question. So I would say when we do these consultation sessions, it often starts with the genetics and then becomes a conversation about injury prevention in general. Because as you mentioned, genetics are a small piece of that. In some cases, it's larger pieces depending on the injury and the athlete. So I think really just bringing in a comprehensive mix and talking about it. The other thing too is that for someone like Kevin Durant, that extra 3% does make a big difference. And because we're just touching the edge of this scientific knowledge and we're continuing to grow more and more, that 3% might just be the tip of the iceberg of another 20%. And we don't always present it to athletes because that sounds horrifying, or that sounds like cause for concern. But I think for us, that's a fascinating component of it.
Yes, on the front here.
Hi, I'm Doran Pinnell from Duke University. My late husband was Sheldon Pinnell. You may have taken classes from him. He was a collagen chemist and dermatologist. My question has to do with Eulers-Danlos syndrome.
Yes.
And is your model testing that? For example, Michael Phelps obviously has it. I have it.
So I'll just explain what Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is on a basic level. So essentially it involves hyperflexible joints. And so there's some theory that if you have so essentially by seeing elevated risk for something like shoulder instability, we could actually be capturing Ehlers-Danlos syndrome because people with that syndrome have a higher risk of shoulder instability as a result of hyperflexibility, hyperlaxity. That's a great question, actually. I think maybe if we go through and control, we haven't actually, I don't believe we've controlled for that in our.
No, it's not on our test, but it
Yes.
could be.
Yes,
Okay.
we would love that. Yeah,
All right,
Come
well,
talk to me afterwards.
yes.
well,
That was a fantastic question.
I have one last question, then we're going to wrap up here because we're at the 000 mark. But this is an important one. Who gets the data that you develop, right? We're seeing findings here,
Right.
but does the data go just to the athlete? Could it be supplied, should it be supplied to teams or leagues or, or healthcare companies? Or how do we negotiate that space?
The athlete decides, so you, right now, you would get it. Then you have the choice on who you share it with. So if you have your own trainer, you could share it with your own trainer. Then we work with your trainer, and you don't have to learn all of this stuff. They just tell you what sorts of exercises to do. If you want to, give it to the team trainer, that's up to you. But otherwise, the team and the league would not have to know about your genetic results.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Dr. Kim and Megan, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. Appreciate all the great questions.
Thank you.